this evening, delighted to welcome Lorenzo Vigotti, who is a researcher based at Columbia University in New York, originally from Rome. This year he's back in Florence. I say back in Florence because 2 or 3 years ago he had a research fellowship at the Medici Archive Project. This year he's got a research fellowship at the Kunsthistorische Institut in Florence, the German Cultural Institute, our friends and analogues along the river, where he's doing further research into his research area, which is the origin of the Renaissance palace, typology in Florence in the late medieval, early Renaissance period. That's by way of introduction. So I'll now say over to you, Lorenzo. Unmute yourself and please give us your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you to all the Institute to host me tonight. I, in fact, have been a student of the Institute for several years while studying English before moving to the US. So I'm very grateful and to be here and to present you my latest exploration of my research. That is about the origin of the Renaissance palace typology in Florence across the 14th and the 15th century. Usually, the iconic Palazzo Medici, started to build in 1446, is considered the iconic building, the iconic palazzo that started this very famous typology that became the typology for any domestic residence for centuries, throughout the 18th century at least, but even later, as we're going to see tonight. Originally, the palace, as you probably well know, was only a kind of a shorter facade, only have 3 opening on the ground floor and 10 bays windows on the upper floors. The Palazzo Medici is very famous and has become celebrated by contemporary scholars, but also, of course, art historians and architectural historians today for 8 reasons mostly. And those are the 8 that you can read on the screen. And I want to explore briefly those 8 reasons because they are the reasons why we truly believe that Palazzo Medici is that important and became the starting point of this typology. So the first point is the location. It's visibility, the visibility of the palace inside the narrow medieval fabric of Florence. As you know, Palazzo Medici is located on via Cavour today, but what was called Via Larga, large, almost like Broadway back then in the Renaissance. So already the location, the choice of being so visible, so close to the baptistry, to the center of the religious center of Florence, but also visible from the square in between the baptistry and the Duomo, and visible as well from all Via Larga all the way to San Mark. So you have 2 very important points of the city from which the palace is highly visible. A palace that doesn't have an isolated footprint. It's along the street. So what we perceive today is the fact that is prominent corner, and especially the fact that the street bends a little bit from the first stretch between the baptistry and the palace itself. A little bend allows us to perceive the facade even though we are walking into the street. So that's already something important. The Medici wanted this palace to be seen and be part of the center, the real center of the city. The second aspect of the palace is rusticated facade. It's a very prominent. If you experience walking near the palace, you have probably experienced these very projecting blocks of stone coming out from the ground floor of the palace. It's very evident, but the rustication is not the same throughout the 3 floors. In fact, it comes smoother and smoother going up. So it's very rough with stones that sometimes projects 50 centimeters from the facade, and it comes more gentle, more refined all the way up, becoming almost a stone masonry only. So there is this very three-dimensional aspect to the palace, especially to the ground floor. A third aspect of the palace is its symmetry. The fact that we only have one portal to access the palace, and is located right at the center of the facade, of the main facade on Via Cavour. Now, the facade on the ground floor changed a little bit. We know that there were a loggia, open loggia on the corner, on the left edge of the left side of the facade, but that was closed 1 century after the construction of the palace. But the only entrance to the inner quorum, to the courtyard of the palace, has only been the central portal. So this is very important. We will see why this is in fact a big change. The symmetry kind of, as you can see, yes, the facade is symmetrical, but it's not perfectly symmetrical. You see the windows on the upper floors do not, they're 10 in number, so you cannot align a central window above the door. And in fact, they are not aligned with the openings. And even those small square windows on the ground floor, you see there are 3 on the one side, 2 on the other. So clearly Michelozzo, that was probably the architect of this palace, who designed this palace for Cosimo de' Medici, wasn't that worried about symmetry as much as we will be today. So this is a minor point, but still very important for later palaces built on the design of Palazzo Medici. The fourth point is a classicized cornice. This cornice is different from the experience of other palaces in Florence. Still today, I feel that when you walk in the streets of Florence, you can look up and look at more traditional roofs that are projecting out from and covering the facades and the sidewalks. They are not made in stone. They are not projecting as much as in Palazzo Medici. Of course, scholars have, trying to ask themselves the origin of this design, where Michelozzo could have seen something like that. Many of them are pointing to the Colosseum or other ancient Roman architectures in Rome and around Italy. So the fact that Michelozzo wanted to top a very traditional Florentine palace with something that is coming from somewhere else, in time and in place. Fifth point, the horizontal division of the facade in 3 floors that are clearly marked by string courses. This was already something that was happening in Florence, but clearly because the rustication changes, because the difference in between each floor, this is very evident. So the 3 floors and these evident string courses really divide horizontally the palace, showing us also the different uses of the 3 floors. A ground floor that is open to the semi-public space, open to guests and visitors. We have a first floor, usually called piano nobile, because is reserved to public spaces like a sala, a reception room, the chapel in the case of this palace, but also to kind of more semi-private rooms in which important guests could meet with Cosimo and his sons. A third floor that in this case is usually reserved for more for servants or for additional bedrooms. In this case, because the Medici were a large family, you have more bedrooms and storage spaces on the top floor, on the 3rd level, that is the driest and is the least accessible from the street. Let's move on. 6th point, a continuous street bench. Another characteristics of medieval Florence was the presence of street benches along palaces or along even churches. If you go around the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence, you see that there are benches all around the structure. So this is not something new, but of course the Medici are using it for two main reasons here. You see that are imposing benches, very refined, although probably the blocks of stone has been replaced many times in this case. The design is probably the original one, and we have these very large street benches inviting people to sit. Now, the Medici were not, they didn't do this because they felt gratitude, they wanted to offer a public service to the Florentines. Those benches were probably used for clients of the Medici, for people that were waiting to meet with a Medici family or with servants or with the household in general, and they were seated outside. Of course, these are not the most important guests. If you were a prince, a duke, a cardinal, you weren't supposed to wait outside. But those benches work in a way like, I think TripAdvisor works today, meaning that if you're walking outside Palazzo Medici and you see so many people waiting to see the Medici, you have a representation of their power, of their connection to the city. In a way like the number of reviews on TripAdvisor, or if you enter in a doctor waiting room and it's filled with people, you know that this doctor is a good doctor. So these social functions are still happening all the time, and the Medici were keenly aware of this. So they wanted to provide a space for that. Of course, the street benches were used for people also looking at what happened in the street. I already told you that the Via Larga was such a broad street in Florence that was used for shows, celebrations, for parades. And so, for example, in this view by Stordano in the 16th century, you see people using the benches to attend, to see what was going on in the street. So a very important addition to Palazzo Medici. 7th point is the Central Courtyard. This is not only a centralized courtyard that works as a place for organization of the palace itself. So all the rooms are facing the courtyard, but also as a space in itself. You see that the courtyard is surrounded by 4 loggias. So you not only have the open space, but you have 4 loggias that we know were very used. It was a flexible space that could be used for entertaining, it could be used as a dining room, it could be used as storage space when needed. So this courtyard that now we have this perception of kind of a musealization of the space, untouched, we know that was a lively space and was at the center of the life of the palace itself. A detail of the courtyard is that this kind of frieze that is marked by the 2 string courses, one supporting the windows on the piano nobile and one supported by the arches of the courtyard. So we have this kind of very large frieze that serve the purpose to be decorated, of course, and to display the coat of arms of the Medici on the 4th side. So we have this kind of design motif that is considered new for Palazzo Medici. Now, the last point, this is just a plan to show you how the court is central to the plan of the palace. Also, how the back of the court has a larger space, so the court is not the same on the 4 sides, and of course the access to the garden. But the last point is about patronage. Why Cosimo wanted to build such an expensive palace? This palace, like others in Florence, were incredibly expensive. And the value of a finished palace like this didn't cover the cost of construction of such a palace. So sometimes scholars have been puzzled by the reasons why behind this kind of a construction. Think that Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici, the fathers of Cosimo, he died in 1429, already had a very large, comfortable house facing Via Larga. In fact, two doors away from the Palazzo Medici today. So they already have a very large house. A 1417 inventory of the house lists 29 rooms with 3 suites that were reserved for himself and his 2 sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo. Each apartment basically was made with a bedroom, an antecamera, a study room or scrittoio, and it was a library number 60 volumes. So it was already an impressive house to be in Florence. So why did Cosimo wanted to build a new residence? Well, this is something that I'll try to address in showing you palaces that were built before Cosimo. In fact, my point is the reasons why Cosimo built this palace were very connected with the reasons of palaces built before him. At the time of the construction, already Palazzo Medici was incredibly famous. Already Giovanni Pontano, there was one philosopher and politician coming from Naples visiting the palace during the construction, wrote, Cosimo in his palace revived an architectural style that was most ancient and forgotten. So already we have a clue of what Cosimo is trying to do. So he's building a large palace, but already is trying to give hints of his political agenda. Giorgio Vasari, in the Vita of Michelozzo, wrote, Michelozzo was intimate with Cosimo de' Medici, with the latter, recognizing his genius, causing to make the model for the house and palace at the corner of the Via Larga. He had the building brought to completion under his direction in the manner that we see as the present day, which all the beautiful and useful arrangements and graceful adornments that are seen therein, which have majesty and grandeur in their simplicity. And Michelozzo deserves all the greater praise in that this was the first palace which was built in that city on modern lines and which was divided up into rooms both useful and most beautiful. So again, a stress on something new, something that is not only for Cosimo, that could be good for kings, emperors, and popes. Vasari was only the first one. We have a long number of scholars up to today that really identified the palace as the typical iconic first Renaissance palace. Those are just examples, but we have many of that. So it's a prototype, is the first Renaissance and modern palace. So basically continuing what Vasari was praising about Palazzo Medici. This is fine because Palazzo Medici, in fact, seems to be the origin of all sorts of Renaissance or neo-Renaissance buildings built after that. You see that all those buildings, in fact, have many or all of the features that we discussed at the beginning. So it seems that Palazzo Medici really became the iconic building of the Renaissance. And I want to push even further. When a new typology was built in New York at the beginning of the 20th century, we have still features coming from Palazzo Medici. We have rustication, we have big blocks of stone, we have a tripartite, we have a change of rustication, we have a change of functions, even in a flat iron building. So that is basically Palazzo Medici stretched all the way with still an imposing cornice that, of course, doesn't have any purpose for such a tall building. So my point is, we have Palazzo Medici, we have medieval tower houses like Palazzo d'Avanzati built until the middle of the 14th century, but basically no one has been exploring what happened in domestic architecture between basically for a century, between the middle of the 14th and the middle of the 15th century. So tonight I'm going to just show you 3 examples Palazzo by the Alessandri, Palazzo d'Auzzano, and Palazzo Buzzini, that as you can see, I selected because they are in a very good shape, very close to their previous, to the original appearance. They are in Florence, of course, and they also have a large family archive that allowed me to research their story. So the three families have a large number of documents still preserved at the Archivio di Stato in Florence. Now, this is not only the reason. This is also a reason for those three palaces, is because those three families were part of an oligarchic government run by the Albizzi that ran basically in the same years. So those three palaces are in fact the showing case of important members of the government that want to use architecture as self-representation, as a tool of self-representation, not far from what Cosimo did in 1446 with his own palace. Now, Florence was very already the Florentines really believed that their city was one of the best, with the best architecture at that time. So we have, for example, Leonardo Bruni, that in 1404 already wrote, "What in the whole world is more splendid or magnificent as the architecture of Florence? Indeed, I feel sorry for other cities when a comparison is made with Florence. In other places, perhaps one or at the most two streets in the entire city are filled with important buildings, while the rest of the town is so devoid of architectural distinction that the townsmen are ashamed to have visitors see these parts. But in our city, there is really no street, no quarter that does not possess spacious and ornate buildings. Almighty God, what wealth of buildings, what distinguished architecture there is in Florence. See the proud of the Florentines living between the 14th and the 15th centuries already." Let's have a look at palaces that were built up to this point. Those are two examples of many that still exist in Florence. Very large buildings, usually at a corner street. Usually they wanted to have some kind of visibility. Usually the ground floor is all open with shops. This because it was, the rent was very important for these families, not only to sell their own goods, all these are merchant families, but also to provide, to have rent supporting the family, the income of the family. So usually those big palaces are dotted with arches that still open today to shops. This is the typical large family house in Florence at the end of the 14th century. We also have a stress on streets and visibility already. We have many streets in Florence, and this is the experience of everyone walking, this idea that of visibility, of seen and be seen. So, for example, the bell tower by Giotto is seen by streets that clearly were designed, oriented to show the bell tower. Now let's go back to our three examples. Let's start with the one by the Alessandri. The first one was built between 1372 and 1378. Now the Alessandri are still a very large family in Florence. Throughout the centuries, they own Villa Tatti, for example, or the Castle of Vincigliata. So they also had very large properties, a large number of properties around Florence. They were patrons of the art. We see members of the Alessandri family kneeling in front of saints here, St. Lawrence. And we know that in the palace, works of art like this were displayed prominently. But let's go back to the architecture. Now, the palace is on Borgo degli Albizzi. It's not very visible, so I'm adding here my drawing that shows you already something that we have seen in Palazzo Medici, and the three portals. You see a facade that doesn't have shops on the ground floor, although unfortunately today there is a shop on the right portal. There wasn't a shop back then, and I'm adding a reconstruction of the facade that I did, the original facade at the beginning of the the beginning of the 15th century, see there are 3 portals only, no shops, and a very a simple but organic division of the facade. The 3 floors, the string courses, 8 windows on the 2 upper floors. The fact that still today the masonry is the rustication is broken is in fact because during the Ciompi revolt in 1378, the palace was arson. And so probably part of the structure collapsed, and basically the Alessandri were never able to finish the palace itself. So that's still something that is unfinished, like many palaces in Florence. Looking at the right edge of the facade, we see something unfinished like that. A legal problem that continued for centuries with neighbors. This is a drawing from a legal document in 1760 that shows you a trial about the real border between the properties. So the Alessandri never finished, but as you can see from the drawing, there is a coat of arms that is overlapping with the other property, a very complicated trial, very fascinating, but we're going somewhere else. I want to show you the rustication. The rustication is not that prominent like in Palazzo Medici, but is going to be more gentle going up. So there is already this idea of having a ground floor that is rougher and upper floors that are
Lorenzo, you see.
But if I overlap with a grid made of squares, you can see that in fact there is order in disorder. Many rooms and many of the spaces, especially starting from the street, are very regular, and their dimensions are in fact following a module. This is very important because it's something that's never been stressed in early Renaissance buildings. The fact that plans are, always following a set of rules. Let's move on to a different building, second one, Dauzzano. Now, the Dauzzano building is not really at the center of the city like the Alessandri in Borgo degli Albizzi, but it's kind of a periphery, is in Via de' Bardi, so Oltre Arno. This is something that I was curious about. So I looked at the location of new palaces built in this period, at least the palaces that we are sure were built in this period. And I overlapped this map with a plan of the new streets that were opened up during this period. So the new streets that were designed, the new streets that were usually larger than the previous one. And as you can see, very interestingly, the new palaces were built on or very close these new areas of the city. New areas that traditionally were neighbors of production, of manufacturing, but not really the places where important families wanted to spend money. But now it seems that at the turn of the century, things are changing. And the idea of having a larger space, maybe a larger lot to build a larger palace with a street that gives you more visibility is something that people will like to do. So Palazzo Dauzzano is in fact on Via de' Bardi, that is very close, very narrow, but is facing the Arno River. Imagine that the Lungarno wasn't built back then, so the palace was on the river directly. And this view by Piero del Massaio shows us the palace itself on the river. So you have large arches on the river. In fact, the palace was accessible from the river Arno. Now, the owner, the builder of the palace is not only a merchant, he was a very important politician, a philosopher. He started the university, the studio in Florence, Niccolò Dauzzano. Together with his brother, they started to build the palace. That looks like this, again, a narrow road. And so I'm showing you the facade as it is today, but also I'm showing you, again, the reconstruction of the facade. Here, regularity is even more attained. We have, again, 8 windows. We have 3 portals that now are pushed into the center. They are kind of more in the center, leaving the rest of the palace of the ground floor as a solid facade. If we go back and see the plan and we want to look at the modules here, again, something that is happening. A little funny, you see along the street, there is 4 modules, 4 rooms and the entranceways, the androne. But look at the courtyard. There is a large courtyard on columns on the back of the palace, and the width of the courtyard is exactly as the width of a module. So clearly there is intentionality. Clearly there is, even with this narrow lot, you are in between the street and the Arno, so you're squeezed in this very narrow lot. There is the idea of following a module in planning the plan of the palace. So the courtyard is in fact the most important characteristic of Palazzo d'Auzzano, because it's probably the first 4 loggias courtyard in Florence, meaning that this is a full courtyard. Now 3 sides have been filled in, but we know that originally the 4 sides were open. Still, the loggias are visible with the beautiful capitals of foglie d'acqua, and so everything is original from the construction. So we have a 3x2 bay courtyard that was open on all sides. Now, already here, we see a strategy that was used in the d'Auzzano that is going to be used many times in Renaissance Florence. I have an example here of Palazzo Pazzi, but the idea that on one side, because the Arno, or because the limits of the property, the borders of the property, you cannot expand your courtyard. You cannot have 4 open, large, deep loggias on the 4 sides. So in Palazzo d'Auzzano, you have this fake loggia opening to the Arno directly, but in Palazzo Pazzi, probably designed by Brunelleschi, you have very similar thing. You have one side of the loggia that is in fact filled in because it's the end wall of the property. So you don't have space for anything else. So already this idea of fiction in the design of the loggia. Another aspect very important for future building that happens already in Palazzo d'Auzzano, designed around 1411, started the construction already there, is the disposition of staircases. You see the staircases are aligned with the loggia of the courtyard. This seems very logical today, but this is again probably the first instance which this happened, and plus is going to become the position of every staircases in every Renaissance palace after Palazzo Medici, but at this point we can say after Palazzo d'Auzzano. I was talking about the connection with the Arno, very important. Palazzo d'Auzzano, really an example of residence in which the importance of views of the city. You are Oltrarno, so from the Veroni, from the balconies, from the courtyard of the Palazzo, you have the cityscape of Florence. You have the Arno. So the Arno was used much more than today. Today is something that we don't pay much attention to, but back then the Arno was really important. We have Villani writing something like, they sent forth a proclamation that whatsoever desire news of the other world should come on the first day of May upon the Carraia Bridge and beside the Arno. And they erected upon the Arno stage, upon boats and vessels. And thereupon they made the similitude and figure of hell, with fires and other pains of suffering. What is going on? They are reenacting the Inferno by Dante on the Arno. So we have theatrical shows played on the Arno. So the Arno is not something that divides. In fact, it's almost like a street, almost like a square, is being used by the Florentines. Another passage by Villani wrote in 1172, Pope Gregory X, King Charles, and the Byzantine Emperor Baldovino met the entire population of the city under Ponte Rubaconte, so under the bridge next to Palazzo d'Auzzano. So because sometimes, often the Arno was also frozen, doesn't happen anymore, but it was frozen, so really was a square for the city. Let's move on to the third example that we have, Palazzo Buzzini. This is a kind of a less important family in the history of Florence, but a very rich merchant family. As you can see, again, very prominent location next to the bridge, next to the previous position of the city walls before they were demolished. So a large street that was left out from the demolition of the walls. And this is at the center. You see Palazzo Buzzini. Now, Palazzo Buzzini has a facade that kind of different from the rest. In a way, it's more modern because it doesn't have a real rustication, but has a not a painted rustication, but it's a graffito rustications. Graffito, as you know, is this decoration that kind of much simpler than fresco or than having a real rustication on your facade that was employed in Florence. But as you can see, the idea is to replicate blocks of stone in the color and in the shapes. So this is very important. The facade is, again, very regular, 8 bays of windows. The 2 openings of the shops are very recent, didn't happen for the first centuries of the palace. So in this case, we have really one portal only. We have one portal. It's not right at the center of the palace, but allows us to go directly to the courtyard. And here we have truly or already kind of a Renaissance courtyard. Not only that, but if you paid attention at the beginning of the lecture, you remember the frieze, and the frieze is already here. This idea that you have 2 string courses in between the arches and the windows in the courtyard that allows to the family to put their coat of arms, to put decorations. So this is something very important, especially when I show you the 2 courtyards one by one, you know, one side the other one. So you see how already Palazzo Buzzini works very well as an entry point directly from the street through an androne to a courtyard. We are not 100% certain that the courtyard was finished already at the beginning of the palace, but the idea was there. So the idea of this beautiful, solid column, one piece, Pietra Serena columns, making the courtyard, really we are not far from Palazzo Medici. And what we see today of Palazzo Medici is also filled with later decorations. So we have to imagine the courtyard of Palazzo Medici much simpler, and so in a way closer to what we perceive today of Palazzo Buzzini. This is not only the interesting part of Palazzo Buzzini. Palazzo Buzzini, like Palazzo Alessandri and Palazzo d'Auzzano, was built not by one person, but always by a pair of brothers. It seems that when you have to put so much money, when you have to abandon previous family houses, and you want to start this enterprise of building a completely new building from scratch, you don't want to be by yourself. You want to merge fortunes, and you want to build a palace that allows for the 2 families to be conveniently separated in the same building. Now I'm showing you the 2 set of staircases that probably were built originally in Palazzo Buzzini. This is not much different from what was going to happen in Palazzo Strozzi 60 years later, when the Strozzi as well built a large palace for 2 brothers, and they needed one courtyard, but 2 staircases and 2 set of apartments, completely divided. Palazzo Buzzini has already all that in the design. Let's go back to the modules. Palazzo Buzzini, even though it's in a regular lot, even though was there were already pre-existing buildings that were used and merged in the palace, shows terrific regularity in the modules. Again, the side of the courtyard is exactly the length of the module itself, and even if everything is tilted, you see that at least from the street for the first 2 bays, everything seems to be very close to the rules of the modules that we explored. The palaces have a number of features that we can pick up to show you a direction, to show you a progression in the design of architecture. I going to stop here just shortly to show you the proportion of the portals. After Palazzo des Alessandri was still kind of a large portal in ratio with its height. After that, most of the palaces followed the rules of 2x4 or 2x1 ratio in the size of the portals. So we can identify some characteristics that becomes regular, becomes almost expected in buildings like that. This is the position also of the staircases. I told you about Palazzo d'Auzzano, but staircases are moving in those palaces. Palazzo Alessandri still have staircases facing the front, facing the facade, not something that you would like to do, so that was kind of abandoned. Palazzo d'Auzzano aligned with the loggia, we saw that become very, very successful in the future. Palazzo Medici has an arrangement like that. And we have Palazzo Buzzini that has, of course, this repetition to staircases. I'm going to finish. Why? Let's go back to the first original question. Why those merchants and why the Medici, in fact, wanted to put so much money, so much effort in something that made them bankrupt sometimes? We know very famously the Strozzi Palace was never finished because the brothers went bankrupt. That was common. So you want to stop a lot of your cash in something, you want to put a lot of your cash in something that is not a good investment, it just seems for yourself, for your ego only. Now, let's consider the period of the oligarchy. The period of oligarchy is a period during which no public architecture was built. Private residence built during the 14th and 15th centuries, during the oligarchy, show that members of the oligarchy embodying the power of the Florentine state in an unprecedented manner. Previously, the comune, the governments before the oligarchy, built large public buildings. And we have examples during the Trecento of such larger buildings, all kinds of typologies. And it could be really an endless number of buildings. These are just the most recognizable that are built up to the oligarchic government. It seems that the members of the oligarchy stopped building public buildings, and they needed to signify their new role in the comune and use residences that could compete with civic palaces and different structures that were built by the guilds, by the people during the previous era, and celebrate the achievements of the comune. So if in previous era we have large public buildings celebrating the state, now we have private residents are celebrating the states. So we have a lot of money put in this new construction, not only restoration of previous structures, but of family houses, that has always been the case, but something completely new, something that would show to the Florentines the power of the narrow number of the oligarch of the city. So during the oligarchy regime, construction of public buildings halted and large private residences started to replace the established centers of the government. We have multiple accounts found in contemporary literature that confirm that this shift was noticed by Florentines who were fully aware of this process of privatization. So there was a process of privatization of architecture that was mirrored by, or the other way around, it was a manifestation of a privatization of city politics that eventually paved the road for the emergence of the Medici. And then we are back to the Medici. So if we look at what Cosimo did with Michelozzo in Palazzo Medici and his role in the city, we see that this is something that clearly wasn't new. Cosimo learned very well from the previous Albizzi oligarchic regime, both in architecture and both in strategies of government. And so when he was planning, together with Michelozzo, a new residence, clearly he was looking at what was going on in Florence, or what happened in Florence, and clearly he wanted to do, of course, something more, a next step in that direction, but something that that was, I don't think it was perceived completely new by the Florentines, but that's in fact the case. Cosimo wanted to be recognized as the new leader, the only leader. And in fact, the fact that not many other residences were built at this time, but Michelozzo as the the focus on building Palazzo Medici only, I think it's already say something about the new Medici government. Thank you so much.
Whoops, thank you very much. Indeed, Lorenzo. Just give myself back. There we are. Start the video. There I'm back. Yes, thank you very much indeed. And as normal, we will now invite questions and comments. I've got a couple of questions on the chat, which I can read out on behalf of, first one, Michael and Maria, and second one from Nick Gent. Unless you guys would like to unmute and ask your questions yourself. Give you a chance to do that? No? Okay.
Please, you can read it.
From Michael and Maria, the emergence of the courtyards, was that due to Moorish influence? Do you know anything about that, Lorenzo?
That's a great question. Thank you. The merchants were travelers, as we know. They had direct experience of the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. Let's focus on the Mediterranean. Of course, the number of courtyards, open courtyards in fondues, in public buildings, but also private houses around the Mediterranean. In fact, the Arabic house, and we have great examples from the 14th century in Morocco, in Egypt, in Tunis. We have examples of large domestic space that was already feature a central open courtyard with 4 loggias at the center of the house. So I'm not surprised at all. Of course, scholars have traditionally also looked at the fact that open courtyards exist in religious buildings in Italy. So that's something that was already happening there. But this change from religious to domestic space, the fact that those merchants, they were not royal, they were not kings or popes, so not royal palaces, wanted to build an open courtyard with 4 loggias, very expensive. Also a waste of space, because a large courtyard is a waste of space in your own house, especially when you have narrow plot in medieval Florence, signifies the importance of these spaces in their daily life.
But could I, sorry,
please,
what about the Romans? I mean, the Romans had courtyards. If you look at Pompeii, or they're just normal people's gardens and houses. I mean, you know, quite wealthy people, but everyday city, they had courtyards, didn't they?
They have courtyards only for villas, mostly, and for very, the 1% houses, domus in the city. Yes, not on many floors like that. Not courtyards that organize. They don't have gardens in these courtyards. They do not. They're not used to collect water, for example. They are clearly used for entertainment, for deposit sometimes to stack goods. But the idea that you have the staircases, the entranceway from the street, those courtyards are the first space that you encounter once you walk inside those palaces. So are very important. In a Roman domus, in an ancient Roman domus, that's far back in the house. So it's not the first space that you encounter to do that. Plus, they have no idea about the ancient Roman house in a way. Late 14th century architects, Vitruvius was still.
Lorenzo, you've frozen.
Kind of a known entrance, but even Vitruvius doesn't have a good representation, a good description of the Roman house. So I feel that this is a much more local and current contemporary progress than something that they were looking back at the ancient house.
Thank you. I encourage anyone who's not in their pajamas and feels like joining in to start your video, because it's nice to see who's here. So don't be shy. Let's see some videos. And as Ari just did, people are welcome to unmute and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll go back to the chat. Oh, that's some people coming through. Lovely to see you all. So next one on the chat from Nick Gent. Two questions in one here. How many of the palazzi are still owned by the same families? I know the Alessandrini are still there. And where did the stone come from for the facades?
Wonderful questions, because something I forgot to mention is that the Alessandri, in fact, are the only probably family that still owns and inhabit the palace that built in the 14th century. I don't think we have other Florentine families that built a palace in 1370s and still are owner of the palace. If you know other examples, please let me know. And so they still live in the palace. And that means that the Piano Nobile of Palazzo Alessandri, in fact, is one of the few intact residential space in Florence. Very, very important space. Unfortunately, it's not easy to get in, but it's great. Where the stone came from? The stone, well, we have two different stones. We have Pietraforte and Pietraserena, as you know, in Florence. The quarries were very close to the city. In fact, next to Fiesole, we have quarries of Pietraserena, and south of Florence, where the autostrada runs today, we have many quarries of Pietraforte. So stone wasn't a big problem for Florence, and quarries were kind of close. That doesn't mean that stone was cheap. Remember that the 99% of building material in Florence was bricks, because they're much easier to produce and transport. Blocks of stone are very hard to carve and to be transported and put in place on a construction area. So very expensive.
Okay, we have two people with their hands up. Dario Donetti, we can go first, and then after that, Charles Adler. So why don't you unmute yourself first, Dario, and then Charles, and make your point, ask your questions, and I'll ask Lorenzo to respond.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lorenzo. This was wonderful, so interesting, and also I must say very innovative. So I'm really grateful that you shared this research. I have two questions actually. The first is maybe broader. I wanted to ask you if you think that new characteristic that you found in these early palaces of this modularity based on a grid of squares might have been originated by a drawing practice, by the way in which the projects for these palaces were actually designed. And then I had another question that maybe is interesting for the institute that is hosting your lecture today. And I wanted to ask you, as a conoscitore, as a connoisseur of 400 palaces, what do you think of the attribution of Palazzo dello Strozzino, which is often attributed to Michelozzo, and also its courtyard that now has been transformed into that cocktail bar?
Thank you, Dario. Well, the second question about the Palazzo dello Strozzino, I cannot say, has been so much transformed, and you know, the facade, of course, was completed on much later. So there was a church side to the palace. I cannot say it was Michelozzo itself. What has been said about Palazzo Buzzini, for example, is that probably Vasari, in fact, attributed Palazzo Buzzini to Brunelleschi himself. He wrote that Brunelleschi made a wooden model for the palace. And so, you know, Michelozzo, as a follower of Brunelleschi for so much architecture, it could be that you know, Palazzo Buzzini, in fact, is real prototype for not only Palazzo Medici, but Palazzo dello Strozzino. About drawing practices, as you know very well, we don't have drawings coming from the architects that built these palaces. In fact, we don't have names for these architects. We have a lot of documents for the masons, for the all the people, operai, the workers that were paid every day, but we don't have names for the people in charge of the design. That opens up a very interesting other set of questions. But so we don't have drawings. And the fact that the idea that the module coming from drawing practices, without the material, it's hard to say. I would say that maybe comes more from the legal division of city lots that was already in place in Florence. I try to measure those modules, try to see if they correspond more or less to the dimensions of the medieval city lots that were used in Florence. It's a common experience. If you walk around the city, you see that there are modules of one door and one window or one shop. So that is the narrows of the modules, and you have sometimes a multiplication of that, 2, 4, 8. So the fact that the 3 palaces that I presented today have 8 windows and usually have 4 modules behind them allows me to think that, to guess that maybe they were reasoning in modules of 2 more than more abstract drawing practice.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Charles, it's your turn.
Hi, I also have 2 questions, if I may. The first actually follows on the last question, which is, to what extent do we think that Brunelleschi either had a hand or his ideas influenced Michelozzo, specifically in Palazzo Medici?
Okay. Well, if we look at Florence in 1411, and we see Palazzo Buzzini with this beautiful courtyard with Pietra Serena columns. The only other place that was under construction at the time with the same columns is the Loggia of the Spedale degli Innocenti by Brunelleschi. So we have clearly a mark. So if Brunelleschi wasn't in charge of Palazzo Buzzini, clearly there was something hot that was happening. And so wherever was in charge was looking closely to what Brunelleschi was doing. So Brunelleschi, we know that Vasari, in fact, wrote that Brunelleschi was asked by Cosimo de' Medici first to design the palace, his new palace, but his project was discarded because the palace was too large, too large for Florentines of that time. So almost a princely palace, and so something that he deemed to be too much for the politics of that time. Not that the Michelozzo built a small palace, but something that is closer to the dimensions of the palace that we already have seen. So the only we don't have documents, real documents about this connection. The only source that we have of an interaction between Brunelleschi and Cosimo on the construction, on the design of the palace is Vasari, that of course is reliable to a certain point. Again, if we look at Palazzo Buzzini as maybe a Brunelleschi-inspired palace, and we look at Palazzo Medici as Michelozzo's palace, I think we can make several links, and that Palazzo Buzzini can really be used as a prototype for Brunelleschi, by Brunelleschi, for Michelozzo in Palazzo Medici. The disposition of the courtyard, the staircases, the androne aligned with the courtyard, the frieze that I show you inside the courtyard. There are so many details that in fact links the 2 structures. Of course, the Medici built that with more money than Buzzini, and 30 years later. So much happened in Renaissance art and architecture in those 30 years. So of course, Palazzo Medici is more refined. But my aim tonight is to show you that, yes, it's more refined in the decoration, but it's not much refined in the design of the architecture.
Thank you. I got to go on. Go, Charles.
Something that I've always been curious about, the idea of rustication, this large rustication, seems to me to be dangerous if you are living in a dangerous city and your home is meant to be something of a fortress. It really does allow for someone to climb up more easily than if it were smooth. And I just wondered in that time whether that was ever considered.
Security was a big issue, of course. And remember that during the oligarchic regime, fights happen. The Ciompi revolt happened. The palace, the Alessandri Palace was arson. So those kind of things happen all the time. Yes, rustication makes it a little easier to climb up. But those palaces were usually very well guarded. There was always somebody awake, looking for people. I think the perception of the rustication as something sturdy, as something that timeless, that will build something to last forever, was a much more important statement than security for them. Although security, again, was important. There was a street bench, and the windows on the ground floor, as you have seen, are usually very high from the ground. So that's something that, of course, they knew about it. We have a few accounts of people climbing palaces, but it seems not a very important consideration for them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo. I have two more in the chat, two more questions, which I'll read out, and then you can respond. And after that, I'll give one more chance to people who want to unmute and ask, and then we'll probably move towards an end. So in the chat from Cindy Ainsworth, we have, is it possible to visit the courtyards of any of these palazzi? And from Penny Howard, we have, did they bring horses into the courtyards? Were there stables inside the ground floor of the palazzi?
Thank you. Great. Well, first, the tour guide question is no. Those are private palaces. You cannot visit with a normal tour or with a ticket those three courtyards. You can ask. In fact, in Palazzo Dauzzano, now it's called Palazzo Capponi, host on the ground on the Piano Nobile, Stanford University. So maybe if you have a contact there, you can ask to visit. Palazzo Alessandri had Florida State University on the ground floor until recently, now and not anymore. But the courtyard, the main portal sometimes is open, and so maybe you can venture inside, although I shouldn't say something like that. And Palazzo Buzzini is now divided in private apartments, many of them on rent, so maybe you can rent one night Palazzo Buzzini, or waiting for somebody to come out and ask if you can see the courtyard. But unfortunately, they are all closed. The second question, horses. Yes, they have stables on the back or on the side of the palaces. So I don't envision much horse traffic from the main facade, apart from the owner, maybe. But we have to imagine many mules, many horses going back and forth inside and out those palaces that were also, again, depot for merchandising, letters every day, very busy palaces, very busy life, people going in and out from the back, from stables and open space, sometimes secondary courtyards located on the back of the palace. But the idea of a facade that, it was kind of, so you always have a back entrance in a way to the palace itself, a service entrance. So that's something that was already important for them back then.
Piece of trivia which just pops into mind, and which I believe is true, is that none other than Bob Dylan, when building his mansion at Malibu, was asked what he wanted to do. He said, the only thing I need is to make sure I can ride in through the front door on my horse. Whether that leads to a courtyard and stables, I don't know, but I thought I'd throw that in. Any last thoughts which may be more relevant than mine? Yeah, Nancy, yes, please, you've got your hand up, unmute.
I just wondered if the Palazzo Davanzati is not modular, and if there's other ways in which it's different from these newer palaces.
Thank you. Palazzo Davanzati is a great example of what I say, the last great example of a tower palace in Florence. In fact, I placed that at the beginning of the timeline that I show you. Palazzo Davanzati is not modular. It doesn't seem modular. and is basically built as, well, the proportions are more or vertical than horizontal. So the three palaces that I show you clearly shows the idea that you want a large facade that is larger than higher. Palazzo Davanzati, or Davizi, I was called at the beginning, clearly shows still the idea of a tower, something that is higher than larger. Of course, it's built in the most prestigious, most expensive neighborhood of the city, Porta Rossa, that was really the center, the financial center, almost like Wall Street today, or the financial district in the city of London. So very expensive lots. So of course, verticality was demanded, but it's very regular. The courtyard is, the loggia is only two sides. The main room, when you enter, you don't have an idea of an androne channeling you to the courtyard, but you have a large space at the beginning that was probably a shop for the Davanzati goods. So we have a showcase of a large shop, in fact, with the house on top of it. It's completely different from the idea of having a solid facade on the ground floor without shops. So we have functions limited to residential only. And this is a big change. Those families had other shops in other parts of the city. But we have, for the first time, probably, a separation of business and current daily business and residential functions. So those palaces were built only for the living and, of course, meetings and business, meaning around the table, but not the real core of the business that those merchants were doing. That was production of textiles and, of course, selling goods from all around the world.
Jovan Georgievich, I hope I said it right. I think you wanted to.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the British Institute for these wonderful lectures that we have each Wednesday. And thank you also for this lecture. It was really interesting. My question is, I read a text that the different layers of the Medici Palace are also devised to be associated with different ways of life. So the lowest one with the most rustic facade would be associated with the Palazzo Vecchio and the sort of political way of life, the Piano Nobile with the Or San Michele and the sort of merchant class, and the highest one with the pious or spiritual way of life. And in that way, the Medici would send a message that all three key aspects of Florence, so the religious, the mercantile, and the politic, would be embodied in their palace. So is this true, or can it be true, or just like completely folly?
Well, it's a fascinating idea. I didn't read this. Maybe you can send me the source of this reading. I never encountered something like that. It's very compelling. Of course, the Medici wanted to summarize the city on their facade. But what I try to show tonight is that the Medici were also copying what was already being made and designed by the previous members of the oligarchy. The reference to Palazzo Vecchio, of course, has been made several times. The power of the city wasn't there anymore because the oligarchic regime clearly privatized the government, and important decisions were taken in the private palaces of the members of the oligarchy, not in the Palazzo Medici, in the Palazzo Vecchio anymore. So I would say that Cosimo was more interested in copying private palaces built before him than the public palace of Palazzo Medici. Of course, or San Michele, all these are buildings that I show you, and of course, he wanted to show Florence, almost like a summarization, a showcase of Florence in his palace. So this can be possible, but I never encountered a primary source back then written at that time that links Palazzo Medici with those buildings.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We got Brenda. Yeah, get your hand up.
Hi, it's just a
Unmute.
short question. Thank you very much for a great lecture. Enjoyed it very much. Makes us feel closer to Florence here in Dublin. It's a small question. Is it true that the window on the side of the palace, the left side of the palace, was designed by Michelangelo?
You're referring to the windows that is now inserted in what was the loggia, and what was the arch on the ground floor of Palazzo Medici.
Yes.
Yes, yes. It was designed by Michelangelo and is another very important feature in the history of architecture, because it is the first example of a finestra inginocchiata, meaning that has two supporting mensole or brackets below the stele of the window. And so this kind of design was developed by Michelangelo. You can see other examples in Michelangelo's works, like in the Ricetto of the Laurentian Library or in Rome. So this was clearly a mark by Michelangelo.
Thank you.
Can you tell me, Lorenzo, was Palazzo Capone, Palazzo Uzzano, did it change to Palazzo Capone after the landslide in Via de' Bardi? When did it change?
Very good. You know a lot about the history of that part of the city, I see. Yes, Palazzo Buzzini. In fact, if you remember 2 years ago, in front of Palazzo Capone, the Lungarno opens up a big hall happened to be there. So it's a part of the city that's still sliding down. It's really, yes. No, it didn't change ownership because of that. It was already owned by the Capone. And of course, we had more than one slide that happened in Via de' Bardi. We have at least 3 during the late medieval, early Renaissance period, until the last one in the 16th century forced the Duke to basically forbid any construction across the street from Palazzo Capone. So, in fact, today it's part of the garden of Palazzo Capone across the street. You don't have any construction in front of that palace. So, unfortunately, the change of ownership happened very quickly after the death of the 2 Uzzano brothers, because none of them had male heir. And so property changed very quickly.
Thank you very much.
And the Capone do still live in Palazzo Capone.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, that's right. Okay, I think we're getting towards the end. I'm going to ask Sarah to do 2 things. First of all, Sarah, would you put up the link for anyone who needs to register for the What's On Monday newsletter? If you're not getting it, it's probably worth having it come in your inbox on Mondays, because it tells you what's going on and has nice pictures. And the second is I'm going to do my regular weekly appeal for your consideration of helping the Institute out through these difficult and dark years of the dark years. I hope not years, but it's been a year nearly. With the donations of anything you feel that you're comfortable to give us to help us through. And Sarah will put the link for the Just Giving Up as well. Are there any more last questions, or are we ready to wrap? If you want to say something, unmute and speak up. Ari, one last one coming in.
One last thing. I just was interested to hear Lorenzo say he thought the Palazzo Pazzi was by Brunelleschi, because they've also mentioned Michelozzi and Da Maiano. And so I wondered why he thought it definitely was Brunelleschi.
No, you're right. You got me. I'm not sure about it. There are sources that tells us that the first design was by Brunelleschi, but of course it was built much after his death, so he wasn't involved directly with the construction. And the names that you just cited are the names that are usually attached to the real construction of Palazzo Pazzi.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. I think we're getting there. It's probably just time for one last one. If anyone's desperate, get the word in. Otherwise, gone. Well, so it just remains for me to thank Lorenzo for a really interesting and stimulating talk, as has been demonstrated by the richness of the discussion afterwards. We're off to a great start in our 2021 season, the year when everything gets better. So see you all next week to find out all about how the Super Tuscans emerged from the undistinguished history of Chianti. See you next week. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. And don't forget to make your little donation. All right. Good night, everyone.